Was there an Adam? Was there an Eve? Or did we evolve from what we conceived? Either way, we got what we needed when the sun shone down on the Garden of Eden.
Don't you know we're gonna have a Solartopia, Solartopia, Solartopia. Don't you know we're gonna have a Solartopia all over God's green world?
Well, we bit that apple and the garden was lost, and so we had to work to pay the cost. And so we went digging into the ground and started to burn many things we found. But don't you know we're gonna have a Solartopia?
Too many things we found. That's the Divine Dar Williams singing with the legendary Pete Seeger and David Burns from Beacon, New York, who wrote the words to that song, except the word Solartopia, which I wrote. This is Harvey Sluggo Wasserman back here for another hour in the Green Power and Wellness Show and Solartopia, otherwise known as the Progressive Radio Network. We're coming to podcasters out of New York City, but our guests, as usual, are all over the place. We have Renny Robert Cushing from the great state of New Hampshire. You with us, Renny?
I'm with you.
All right.
I'm not with you. I'm in New Hampshire. But it is a great state.
It is a great state and cold as always. And are you in the state legislature now?
I am.
You are. So when are you going to be like the majority leader?
Oh, I'm perfectly content to be chair of the Criminal Justice and Public Safety Committee right now.
And how long have you been in the New Hampshire legislature?
On and off for decades, but this time I've served 7 terms over 4 decades. I used to be a young state legislator, and now I'm a living fossil. I fit
a living legend as well.
Of the New Hampshire House.
You have just gotten a major award for your work against the death penalty, which is spectacular, and we're going to talk about that in between 2 other topics. One is going to be the impeachment hearing that went on today and the debate last night, and which we'd be remiss as Americans not to talk about. Then we're going to talk about your work on the death penalty, and then we're going to finish up with nuclear power, and we're joined for that by the great KEVIN Kamps. KEVIN, you with us?
I am. Thank you.
KEVIN, I think you're actually my most frequent guest, but, you know, things come up with nukes, and I know you're right on top of the case, and you're a great guest with that Midwestern accent that sells you just like Amy Klobuchar. So we and Pete Buttigieg, all the Midwestern candidates there. So
I am
great.
From near South Bend. That's true.
Yes, and you have a big radioactive waste bill that we want to talk about. So we'll get to that. And Renny, you as a New Hampshireite have been involved with the Seabrook nuclear fight for God knows how long. So we're going to have you talk about that too. But we want to start with today's impeachment hearings and last night's debate. I have to say, I sat through Watergate. Watergate was actually one of my most enjoyable experiences. I loved every minute of Watergate. In fact, I'll never forget. I was literally, I couldn't make this up. Well, I could, but I was in a hammock in Mexico, Isla Mujeres, before it got all built up, paying $1 a night for a hammock. I was with a beautiful woman who I was smart enough to bring back with me, and I picked up a Time magazine and I read about Watergate, and I said, I gotta go, and went all the way back to New England to our hippie farm so I could follow Watergate first up. And we listened to Watergate while we were on the radio to the hearings, while we were in our organic garden surrounded by large marijuana plants. And I'm not doing it exactly the same way this time, but I have to say, these hearings have been really fascinating. And the witnesses have been spectacular. And I just watched Adam Schiff give the wrap-up. And I have to tell you, I met Adam Schiff around 3 weeks ago in L.A. He was at a fundraiser. And I said, listen, you got to start referring to President Trump as Fredo. And he looked at me, he as if he had no idea that I was talking about the mafia guy from The Godfather, but I know he did. But he just kind of pretended not to know. And then I said, and you got to get into money laundering. And he said, well, we're considering that, but clearly they're not going in that direction. So, Renny, I don't know if you watched the hearings today or the Democratic debate last night, but give us your all-American 10 cents worth, and then Kevin will follow up.
Well, I didn't watch the hearings today, but I've been following it, and I think it's an example of the total absolute corruption of the Trump era that we live in. And I too have found it compelling. I've found like a fair amount of inspiration from the integrity and the straightforwardness of people who are in our foreign service, corps. And it's just appalling, the kind of, thuggery, mafiosa treatment of our putative allies. It's like a mafioso operation in the White House.
I'll have to differ with you there. It's not like a mafioso operation. It is a mafioso operation. I mean, Kevin, what's your 2 cents worth here?
Yeah, it's been fascinating. I haven't been able to watch it closely because I've been busy with anti-nuke work, but, the parts I've caught, I mean, today it sounds like Fiona Hill really tore the Trump administration a new one, and it's so great that millions of people are able to
so many already.
Follow this closely.
Renny made an interesting point that I hadn't thought about, which is, those of us who've been on the left for all these years and critical of the government, it was almost a new experience to watch government officials who actually had integrity. Since Nixon, since LBJ, really, and the war in Vietnam, we've just assumed that everybody in the government is corrupt. And then you come forward with these people who are really serious and take their jobs seriously and are incorruptible. I mean, it was almost sort of the reverse lesson that came out of these hearings. I'm glad you made that point, Renny. I
don't think people are. I look at people who are in the Foreign Service Corps the same way that I look at people who are in the Public Health Corps. I mean, I think there are people who are mission driven, who care about a sense of community, who look at the best of what a country can be or aspire to be, and try to do their job and make the world just a tiny little bit better every day. I have much more respect for people who dedicate their lives to that than I do, say, hedge fund operators.
Look, that's setting a pretty low bar. Well, Kevin, here's the $64 trillion question. Are there such people of integrity and dedication to public service at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission?
Well, I've been doing anti-nuclear power work for 27 years, and it's a rare bird to find someone like that at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I mean, one example of someone like that would be Dr. Ross Landsman in the Chicago office, who multiple times stuck his neck out to do his job, which was to protect public health and safety in the environment. First at the Midland atomic reactors, which never got fired up, partly thanks to his pointing out that they were sinking into the ground like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And then again with dry cask storage at Palisades on the Lake Michigan shoreline, where he blew the whistle on how dangerous it was, how badly it violated NRC regulations like earthquake safety regulations. So that's one example. Greg Yazko, the former chairman of the NRC, did some good stuff. I mean, he fought the Yucca Mountain dump. He tried to do the right thing after Fukushima, and he got his head taken off for it. I mean, he was run out of the agency, but he did try. I wish he would have tried more on more battlefronts, but the ones he did work hard on, I appreciate very much. And he's written a book about his experience called The Rogue Nuclear Regulator, which is really worth reading.
Yeah.
Well, Renny, you're in fallout range of Seabrook and in the state government. Is there anybody in the NRC that you can count on to tell you the truth about Seabrook?
No.
You want to think about that answer for a minute?
No, I mean that's a continual, ongoing frustration. Although, I actually do. The former Commissioner Jusko, he was in New Hampshire. I don't know, a couple months ago, and he tells an incredibly compelling story about why the nuclear era is long over, and it just hasn't. It hasn't quite caught up to the fact that it's over. But he's
right. Well, let's come back to that.
It's not over because the waste we're going to have to deal with forever. But as far as the notion that we're going to continue to have a nuclear industry, that's a fantasy that's not going to come to pass.
Right. So I want to talk to you about the Democratic candidates for a minute, but before I want to correct one thing. I think it was Adam Schiff who said today that Trump had done stuff that was far worse than what Nixon did. Now I definitely do not agree with that. First of all, Nixon committed treason in 1968, which nobody disputes anymore. I mean, this was a conspiracy theory that we all had, that Nixon somehow intervened to kill the Vietnam peace talks. And then finally the transcripts came out, and by God, it's exactly what he did. And I think that's way worse than what Trump did. I mean, you had at the end of October in 1968, Johnson had called a ceasefire. He had gotten the North and the South to agree to a ceasefire. And, of course, he was doing it so that Humphrey could get elected. But there was the prospect of peace. Just before the 1968 presidential election, and Richard Nixon had his liaison to the South Vietnamese government call the South Vietnamese and tell them to kill the deal, because if they did, then Nixon would get elected, and then he'd give them a better deal, which turned out to be 7 more years of war and 20,000 more dead Americans and God knows how many more dead Vietnamese. That, to me, dwarfs anything that Donald Trump has done. And then secondly, Nixon bombed Cambodia completely illegally. Nixon should have been impeached long before Watergate for his sabotage of those peace talks and then the bombing of Cambodia. And in fact, although we'll talk about the death penalty in a minute, I oppose the death penalty. But in Nixon's case, he should have faced the death penalty for his treasonous sabotage of the 1968 peace accords. I mean, there's no doubt about that. That was treason, flat out. And to me, it dwarfs anything that Donald Trump did. But, we may yet find out more. So just to cover the bases here, Renny, I don't know if you saw the Democratic debates.
I did.
But what you did? Okay, so what did you think?
Well, full disclosure, I'm a co-chair of the Bernie Sanders for President campaign in the state of New Hampshire. So I always appreciate Bernie's clarity, his leadership, his solid answers, and his straightforward approach to things.
And Kevin, how about you?
Yeah, I did see it, and always impressed with Bernie. I think his involvement with the Shutdown Vermont Yankee campaign really got him very much up to speed on the nuclear power and radioactive waste issues, which is great. He, in the past, had taken some very problematic positions on radioactive waste. There was a proposed low-level radioactive waste dump in Sierra Blanca, Texas, right on the border with Mexico, that he was in support of, but he was a representative from Vermont, which wanted to get the waste out of its state, on behalf of his constituents. So it was understandable. It was unfortunate, but I think he's come a long way in the past 20 years on these issues.
I agree, and I have to say, I don't think I've said this before. I don't think Bernie can ever get elected president, not because he's too old, but because he's Jewish. I don't think this country is ready to elect a Jewish guy to be president. I just don't think it's there. And so, but he is always a cut above the rest of the candidates. I mean, his answers were last night, or as they always are, studious, correct, advanced, sophisticated. He's a brilliant, brilliant guy. And I want to say without hesitation that Bernie Sanders is the most important American politician of the 21st century. Right. I mean, he has moved the whole debate so far to the left where it would never have gone without him. Now, admittedly, go ahead, Renny.
No, and he does it in different, he does it in different ways. I was struck, about a month ago, Bernie was campaigning here in New Hampshire, and there was an union organizing drive going on at a nursing home, and of course Bernie shows up and stands in solidarity with it. And I was talking to one of the workers about, how important it was to get the right to organize and to deal with, have a strong labor movement to help combat the growing wealth inequality in this country. And I realized that in the healthcare debate, Bernie Sanders is the only one who's not just going to talk about healthcare for all, but he's going to understand at the bedpan level what it is, what healthcare is about. And by that I mean Bernie is as concerned about the person who's emptying the bedpans of the patients in the hospital as he is about the doctors and all the other, access to health care providers. And that's something that I don't get on a gut level from any other candidates, even those who are, pretty good on the health care debate. Bernie will take care of everybody.
Yeah, well, the question is who's emptying the bedpans in the White House? Right. But Kevin?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not able to hear what Remy's saying. But, about the debate last night, I just wanted to add that I think it's unfortunate that things like nuclear power almost never come up. Like one example was they held a climate forum in early September. It wasn't even an official debate. And Cory Booker, most unfortunately, he's very close to Holtec International. He's very pro-nuclear power. And what was good about that particular forum was that the very next day, Democracy Now! Held a panel discussion about it. And Mustafa Ali, who's the former head of environmental justice at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, said, with all due respect to Cory Booker for his good environmental justice work, I have to take exception with him on this nuclear power position of his. And then he pointed out, just the waste shipments alone bound for these proposed Western dump sites are a huge environmental injustice, because guess who lives along many of these train tracks and highways and even waterways, but low-income people of color communities. So it was really awesome that at least the viewers of Democracy Now! Heard the truth, and we're going to have to keep an eye on Cory Booker, whether he stays a U.S. Senator or moves up, in the world, even on a cabinet position, because his position on nuclear power is really wrong-headed.
Yeah, it's worse than that, because Cory Booker not only is pro-nuclear, but he has mocked and attacked in your traditional Fox News manner those of us who are against nuclear power. I mean, it's one thing that there's three things here you can do. You can support future nuclear power plants, which is ridiculous, and I don't really care about that. These guys want to go out and yap about new nuclear plants down the road. It's not going to happen. They can waste all their breath and all their money, and they're just not going to be built. Then there's the guys like Cory Booker who attack those of us who are fighting nuclear power. I mean, he made some really off-the-wall, Fox News-type comments about us, those of us in the anti-nuclear movement, which were completely gratuitous. And screw him. And I posted an article about that that went around the internet. It's freepress.org if anybody's interested. And so he's not just pro-nuclear; he's a jerk about it. Now, Amy Klobuchar and some of the others have been pro-nuclear, but they haven't gone to that extent. And then finally, there's the issue that's the most important of all, which is what do we do with the reactors that are still running? And I want to come back to that in a couple of minutes, because I want to talk now, Renny, about the death penalty. And you have been one of the leaders of the movement against the death penalty for about as long as I've known you, which was before Jesus was born. And I'd like it if you got a major award in L.A. Earlier this week for your lifelong work on the death penalty. So I'd like it if you would, please, to tell us the story of how you got into your work on the death penalty and what's involved with it now, if you don't mind. And go,
well, I guess I would have to point to my father, who was shotgunned to death in front of my mother and our family home 30 years ago. And from that moment, thinking about what you do in the aftermath a homicide stopped being an intellectual exercise and just became part of my life. And so I struggle with that, like everyone who deals with violent loss. And when there were proposals to expand the death penalty that I had always, I had opposed. Something happened to me a couple days after my father's killer was arrested when I ran into an old family friend in the corner grocery store, and he comes up to me and says, "Hey, Renny, I hope they fry the bastard. I hope they fry the bastard so you and your mother and your family can get some peace." And I really didn't know how to respond at that time because, this is a guy he was saying that he wanted an execution out of what I believe was trying to give me some solace. But I couldn't respond because he'd known that before my father was killed, I had opposed the death penalty. And it dawned on me that he had thought that because my dad was murdered, I would change my position on capital punishment. And kind of a light one, and I said, I realized if I did that, it would only give over more power to the killer, because not only would my father be taken from me, but so too would my values, the values that he helped instill in me. And I think it was the same for society as it is for individuals. If we let those who kill turn us into killers, then evil triumphs. But because of the society that we live in that presumes that family members of murder victims want the death penalty, I felt almost like another burden was imposed upon me for being the survivor homicide victim, and that was to dispel the notion that a lot of political leaders make that they're under some kind of moral obligation to provide an execution solution to victims' pain, and therefore we have to have capital punishment. And I took it upon myself as a survivor homicide victim to speak out against the death penalty. And that came home in 1998. I was in the New Hampshire Legislature, and the issue of the death penalty came up, and there was a big push on in the 1990s. I don't know if you recall. There was a guy from Arkansas who came to New Hampshire in the presidential primary. He was a governor, and he had to leave the campaign trail in Claremont to go back to oversee the execution of Ricky Ray Rector, an African-American man who was so brain damaged that he saved his pudding for after his execution. But, and this was applauded as a new kind of Democrat. It was, went on to become the president. Bill Clinton went on to preside over the expansion of the federal death penalty. And New Hampshire was not immune. We had a Democratic governor who was, frequently enough, we had a Democratic governor who also decided they wanted to expand the death penalty. But I and another friend of mine, an old Clamshell Alliance guy, Cliff Velo, sponsored legislation to abolish the death penalty. And, we weren't the first people to do it because the debate over the death penalty in New Hampshire had been going on since 1834. But, that kind of set off a new round of organizing in New Hampshire that culminated last May 31st when the House and the Senate voted to override a veto of the governor and made New Hampshire a death penalty-free state. And I think it's, for, I guess, a couple decades I've been part of what was once called the anti-gallows movement. It's now known as the death penalty repeal, a death penalty abolition movement. It's part of the global movement toward human rights, and the rest of the world has moved away from the death penalty. The United States is maintaining its exceptionalism in many respects by continuing to think that it's an appropriate policy to have government employees conduct ritual killings of incapacitated prisoners in many of the states. But I'm lucky to be part of a national and international movement toward repeal, and we've had a fair amount of success in recent years, notwithstanding a widespread belief that we need to have the death penalty in order to maintain law and order in our country.
Well, there has been tell us about, describe in numerical terms, if you can, the success and the what's happened with the death penalty, say, in the last 50 years?
Well, in the last 50 years, in 1972, the Supreme Court decided that the death penalty, as it was practiced then, was violation of the U.S. Constitution. It was cruel and unusual punishment, but compositions on the court changed, and you referenced back to President Nixon. He had new appointees to the Supreme Court in 1976. That Supreme Court decided to allow executions to resume in the U.S. And since that time, there have been 1,600 people who've been put to death in the death houses throughout the country. At one time, it rose to, I think the high point was in 1998 when Massachusetts temporarily became the 39th state to reinstate the death penalty. But shortly after that, there were almost 98 people were executed in 1999. But at the same time, there also was emerging a renewed opposition that I think initially was driven by the realization that the death penalty was putting innocent people to death, that we were putting innocent people on death row, and that gave people a lot of pause. Governor Ryan in Illinois found himself in a position where he had 25 people had come off death row, 12 were executed, and 13 were found to have been wrongfully convicted. He instituted a moratorium. A combination of organizing in state houses, of more effective litigation, and there's been a narrowing of the scope of the death penalty. There was a time when we used to permit juveniles to be put to death, and we banned the execution of juveniles. There was a time where people with intellectual disabilities could be put to death, and we've banned that. And I think the more we learn about the death penalty, the less there is to like. And someone said support is a mile wide and an inch deep, and there's lots of compelling reasons. I'm from New Hampshire, and as you know, we're kind of conservative and quirky. And though it's a conservative state, we do have the people don't trust the government to collect taxes or plow snow. So why really would you want to give the government the power to kill prisoners? It's the liberty argument that's very strong. And we put together in my state, we had a kind of an interesting grand coalition of left, right, civil libertarians and the Catholic bishops, next to each other, the Second Amendment enthusiast with with the Sisters of Mercy. It's been a very powerful movement because people realize it's an area where you can find kind of common ground. And if we find common ground on the death penalty, we can find common ground on other criminal justice reform issues as well.
Well, when was the last person executed in New Hampshire?
1939.
Really? That long ago?
It was that long ago. We had one person now who's on death row that remains on death row. But in the 8 states that have repealed the death penalty in the past, in the past 20 years in this country, no one has been put to death in states that have repealed it. And while we don't make laws that are retrospective, the courts have uniformly found that it would be really freaky to repeal the death penalty and go forward with killing whatever other prisoners were arraigned on death row.
So how many people were executed last year in the United States?
I think there were like 25, 30.
And
a relative handful. We've seen a decline in death sentences real steadily. New York, New Jersey, New Mexico, Maryland, Illinois have all abolished the death penalty. There's moratorium that have been imposed by the governors in California, in Oregon, and in Washington. there's movements, and again, it's there's a big movement. Conservatives concerned about the death penalty. Conservative voices have emerged really powerfully, very powerfully, in the death penalty debate now. People that you might not readily think of as being opposed to the death penalty, but who quickly embrace it as just another failed government program that the only people that make money are lawyers, and it's a recipe for graft and mistakes.
We're speaking with Renny Cushing and KEVIN Kamps. KEVIN is from the anti-nuclear group, and we're going to finish the show with him talking about a very important piece of legislation, the nuclear waste legislation. But Renny, what is the name of your organization?
Well, I work with a group of other family members of murder victims called Murder Victims Families for Human Rights. But I'm also primarily right now I'm a state representative.
In the state of New Hampshire. And what is the organization that
chair of the
gave you
Criminal
the award?
Justice and Public Safety. I received one of the awards. It was given by Death Penalty Focus, which is the largest grassroots anti-death penalty organization in the country. And I was honored to be recognized for not just for my work, but it's really the work that was done in New Hampshire. Sometimes doing anti-death penalty work, victories can be few and far between. It's really easy to see defeat. What a defeat is, what a loss looks like. A loss looks like somebody who gets strapped down in a gurney, has poison pumped into their veins till they die, and then they fill a coffin. It's a little more challenging sometimes to find the victories. But I think what people recognize, when you win a vote by one vote after you've been trying for 185 years, you realize that everything that everybody did mattered in the end. So everybody who ever signed a petition, ever stood a vigil, ever engaged in civil resistance, ever contributed to an anti-death penalty or human rights organization, helped to repeal the death penalty in New Hampshire. And because of New Hampshire's repeal of the death penalty, it can serve as an example and hopefully an inspiration to other states to continue in the struggle till we live in a world where...
Are there any states in the United States that have gone longer without an execution than New Hampshire? You said New Hampshire, the last one was, 1939? Is anybody...
there are states that have not had the death penalties. Michigan abolished the death penalty in the 1840s after they had, wrongfully executed people. Maine has abolished the death penalty. There's places that have abolished the death penalty, for centuries. In terms of states that still have the death penalty that have gone longer, that haven't used it, I'm not sure. I do know one of the things about the death penalty is if you do an overlay of death penalty states with slave states, and you'll see that the death penalty has been concentrated. The use of the death penalty has really been concentrated in those states where slavery was there. And
somehow
the death penalty is in a way a continuation of a system of control and subjugation of people who are marginalized or powerless. That's the death penalty in this country is not reserved for the worst of the worst. It's reserved for those who have the worst lawyers. And it's often said you're better off to be, to be guilty and rich than innocent and poor.
Look at O.J. O.J. was guilty and rich, and that's exactly if the shoe fits or something like that.
Right.
So Michigan abolished the death penalty in the 1840s. Has anybody been executed in Michigan since the 1840s?
No. Maine.
Nobody.
The M state. No.
Did any state in the United States ever not have the death penalty?
Not really, because it was the common law states always had it as part of the bills. I mean, they used to. We no longer have a debate in this country about whether you'll get the death penalty for practicing witchcraft or sodomy, but that is part of the history in the U.S. in the year in the 21st century. We have a debate the death penalty because people are murdered, and I don't lose track of that. And you don't want.
So what is the key now? Renny Cushing. Here's the big question. I'm going to ask Kevin Kamps this about nuclear power. What is the key to abolishing the death penalty forever in the United States? How is it going to happen? How are you going to help make that happen?
I'm kind of, step by step, inch by inch. I don't think there's any one thing that's going to do it. I think the lesson I learned from, being part of a continuum of the struggle in New Hampshire that goes back to 1834, that it took that 185 years, that 9 generations to do, is that you have to continue. You just have to continue to plug away and have faith that you'll ultimately prevail. It's that, as Dr. King always talked about, where the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, and that's part of what this struggle is. It's a struggle for you.
But we are in a position now where the number of executions is continuing to drop. Is that correct?
It's right. And there's more time. There's like 700 people in death row in California, and Gavin Newsom decided to dismantle, he put a moratorium on executions and has dismantled the death chamber there. But it's still on the books, and it's still being fought over, and it's contested. And that's, California is the biggest death row. Texas has the most active one. But
there's 700 people on death row in California?
Yes. Yep.
And how many are there in Texas?
There's probably, maybe I should know, 100, very few, because Texas has an active death house. They kill more people in Texas than any.
So they actually kill the people on death row in Texas as opposed to keeping them on death row in California.
Right.
Oh God, pretty.
I mean,
pretty
I think it is somewhat complicated. They've been keep tinkering with the machinery of death, trying to figure out, how are we going to do it right. And that's the issue, in California. All of a sudden, that you decide that they want to maintain the illusion that it's not really we're not really killing people. It's almost like a medical procedure. We want to get a little bit of alcohol swab and swab the skin before we stick the needle in, and then just before we put the poisons in. And what's outrageous and what has happened is that medicines that were compounds that were intended for medical purposes are used instead to kill. And what happened, particularly with Europe's consciousness, Europe, they dealt with this. They dealt with kind of a government killing on a massive scale during the 1940s. There, under the color of law, of course. And after World War II, part of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was an aspiration that to instill the respect for law, and that the government does. There's certain things that the government does not have the authority to do, but we're entitled to. And one of those is the right to life, and the other is the right to be free from torture. And the death penalty violates both of those rights. So Europe's moved ahead of it, and now all of a sudden, European companies, when they come to find out that their medicines, their pharmaceuticals, are being used in the United States to execute people, the EU and the companies themselves have just cut off the production. They won't shut down the supply. So they're running. We have to get creative. We have to break the law and engage with drug dealers in order to obtain the right medicine so that we can put someone to death. It's just this crazy, bizarre.
It is crazy. Kevin Kamps, I appreciate your patience. We're going to come to you in a minute, but Renny's got to leave, and this is a fascinating discussion. I hope you're able to.
I will tell you a place where I found a connection between nuclear power and the death penalty that you'll appreciate.
Kevin Kamps, are you still there?
I am. Yes.
And it was it was in Mongolia, of all places. I went to Mongolia was considering abolishing the death penalty, and the Amnesty International from Mongolia invited me to go to speak to some other, to the parliament, to the lawmakers at the time. And as they were simultaneously organizing against the death penalty and also organizing against nuclear power, because when I arrived in Mongolia, the big controversy had erupted over the importation of vehicles to Mongolia that had been imported from Japan. And when they got there, they ran a Geiger counter, and those were all Fukushima cars that were highly radioactive that were being dumped.
Oh my God!
In Mongolia, and Mongolia was being eyeballed as an ideal place to dump the world's nuclear wastes because no one was there except the Mongolians. But
and what was the outcome? What happened finally with that?
The Mongolian government abolished the death penalty ahead of.
And what about the nuclear stuff?
And they have not pursued nukes, and they were fighting against that, and they're trying to deal with their kind of a awkward relationship with other Asian countries that are there. Yeah.
Well, Renny Cushing, it's always great to talk. I haven't had you on my show enough. You know, I bring certain people back like Renny, like Kevin, who I know give. As Abby Hoffman once told me, I gave great radio. So you guys give great radio, and it's really great to have you.
It's always a pleasure, Kevin. I'm sorry I can't stick around and listen to you, but we'll see you on the trail.
Very good.
All right.
Renny Cushing, again, congratulations on your award. Keep up your great work. One last quick question, okay?
Yeah.
Really quick. How big an impact has the DNA testing and research had on the death penalty? How many people do you think have avoided being executed because of exoneration through DNA testing?
There are people who've been taken off death row over, I think I can't remember the latest number, but scores of people just taken off death row just because of DNA. But what DNA testing provided a window on is to let us see how prevalent mistakes could be. I mean, there are over 160 people who at one time were on death row who subsequently have been exonerated. And you want to talk about the failure of the death penalty system. But as a friend of mine, Kirk Bloodsworth, said, Kirk was the first person ever to be exonerated by DNA. He was on death row in Maryland for the rape and murder of a 8-year-old girl, and just the worst thing that you could possibly imagine. And again, he always maintained he was innocent. He was sent to death row. There was the new technology came. I want this DNA. I want the test. They had the rape kit from that they had kept from the girl. They tested it, and they found out that it wasn't his DNA.
Amazing.
But as he said, and they eventually found the guy who did it. They exculpated the innocent person and inculpated the guilty one. But Kirk said, you think about it, what it meant is that this girl was raped. Had the guy just killed her, he would be dead. But he raped and he killed the victim. It's just, it's the presence of biological evidence. And in most crimes, there's not a biological evidence. But we can see patterns of mistakes. And, in a way that a system that requires infallibility, people make mistakes. And if the mistake is made, I appreciate there are those who make the friendly fire argument. They think who will acknowledge that innocent people will be put to death, but that's the price you pay to have the civilizing effect of the death penalty. But knowing people who have survived death row, I can't look at anyone in the eye who's done that, and I don't know how anyone else can, and say that it's too big, and say that unfortunately we have to make mistakes in order to keep this system in place.
Well, we did make a mistake with nuclear power. There's no doubt about it. I'm going to talk with Kevin. How do people get a hold of you, Renny? How do they support your work?
You can go to rennycushing.com or mvfhi.org.
Okay, buddy.
You are the
Take
best.
care. We'll have you back.
Thanks.
Good luck and congratulations.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, Renny, the great Robert Renny Cushing, state rep in the New Hampshire Legislature, longtime anti-nuclear stalwart, and a real cornerstone of the anti-death penalty movement in the United States. It's really been great, an honor to have him on. And now we have the great KEVIN Kamps to continue. Kevin, as I say, perhaps my most frequent guest. Tell us now what's happening on Capitol Hill with this insane nuclear waste bill.
Well, it's always an honor to be on, Harvey. Well, unfortunately, just yesterday, this bill, which is called H.R. 2699, the Nuclear Waste Policy Amendments Act of 2019, was passed in the House Energy and Commerce Committee by a voice vote. There's not even a roll call as to how the members voted, but essentially they voted without any opposition in the committee. And I didn't think it could get worse than the last session of Congress, but it just did, because in the last session of Congress, in the committee, we did get blown out, but there was a roll call vote. It was 49 in favor and 4 opposed. It was nearly identical legislation. It was H.R. 3053, just the 2018 version. So even the 4 who voted against last time, for some reason, did not make a peep of opposition this time, and now we're poised for another House floor vote, potentially, and the last time there was one, we got blown out of the water, 340 in favor to 72 opposed, and the only saving grace last session was the Senate didn't take it up. But unfortunately, the Senate has already taken this bill up last May 1st, so we're in a different situation this time.
Well, what are the particulars of the bill?
Well, essentially, long story short, it's a 53-page bill, but what it does is it greases the skids for the opening of the Yucca Mountain, Nevada permanent burial dump for high-level radioactive waste, and it also makes legal the consolidated interim storage facilities for high-level waste that are targeted at Texas and New Mexico. They are currently not legal under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act as amended of 1982, and the illegality with the proposals is that the U.S. Department of Energy is not allowed to take title to take ownership of commercial high-level radioactive waste at an interim site in the absence of an open repository. We have no open repository in this country. The Department of Energy has said it will be until 2048 before a repository can be opened. So Holtec International and Waste Control Specialists, their lobbyists, have been busy on Capitol Hill for years to try to get the law changed so that they can go forward with their de facto permanent surface storage parking lot dumps in New Mexico and Texas, and here they go again, just getting their way.
What a nightmare. So what's the procedure now? This is going to go to the Senate?
Well, there is some hope of stopping this still. Nancy Pelosi is opposed to the Yucca Mountain dump. The Nevada Democrats have convinced her of that. She's long been opposed to it, but she is certainly in the trenches with the Nevada Democrats opposed to Yucca. And the good news for us is the arrogance and the greed and the overreach of the nuclear power lobby, because what they've done is they've lumped the Yucca dump and consolidated interim storage into the same bill. And so you've got Pelosi's opposition to the Yucca part. We need to work on all of the congressional Democrats to educate them as to why consolidated storage is a mistake. But since they're lumped together, you've got Pelosi's opposition. And so one consequence of that is she has farmed this bill out, not just to Energy and Commerce, but to 4 additional committees. So we have a shot at stopping this dangerously bad bill in those 4 other committees. And we've even got a shot in the Senate at stopping it because, believe you me, the Nevada congressional delegation, 2 Democratic senators, and it's a bipartisan House delegation, but they are united in their opposition to the Yucca Mountain dump. We have a lot of work to do on consolidated storage because it's a newer idea, and so we're building support in New Mexico and Texas in opposition. And we've made huge inroads. There's a real groundswell in both states, actually. I mean, even in Texas, you've got the governor of Texas, who's a right-wing Republican, Greg Abbott, and he's pretty much put his foot down. He does not want to become the high-level radioactive waste dump of the United States, and there's precedent for that in Texas. They had to fend off a burial site back in the 1980s.
And they did so successfully. And Texas now, of course, has become a huge producer of wind power, the biggest producer in the United States by a factor of, I think, 2 or 3 over the way more than California. And I think Iowa or Kansas might be second. But Texas has so much wind power that they actually fulfilled the early promise of the nuclear industry. As you'll recall, of course, Lewis Strauss, the first chair of the Atomic Energy Commission, promised that nuclear power would deliver electricity too cheap to meter. And in fact, the wind industry in Texas is now doing just that. You actually can have free electricity in many parts of Texas because there's a surplus of wind energy that's at night, but that's how it's going. So where do we stand at Yucca Mountain? I mean, it's still sitting there. Well, tell us, what's happened with Yucca Mountain in light of all this latest craziness on the Hill?
Well, the Obama administration essentially canceled Yucca in 2010, and it's lacked funding ever since, which is really great. So even now, there's no funding for Yucca, both in these continuing resolutions that are keeping the government limping along, but also even in fiscal year 2020 appropriations bills, because the Nevada Democrats have been so effective, gotten Pelosi on side. Our side has been able to fend off Yucca Mountain funding in the fiscal year 2020 appropriations bills successfully this year. Unfortunately, the consolidated interim storage has gotten funding in those fiscal year 2020 appropriations bills to the tune of $10 to $25 million, depending on which House of Congress we're talking about. So if these continuing resolutions keep going, there's not going to be any funding for Yucca, and also there won't be any funding for consolidated storage because in past, the legislation they're depending on for these continuing resolutions had zero funding for consolidated storage. So if we get lucky, there will be zero for both of these proposed dump ideas. But, long story short, Nevada's been fighting Yucca for 32 years. A relatively small state now, but even back in 1987, they only had one member of Congress. That's why they were targeted in the first place. And they have managed, with the help of 1,000-plus environmental groups across this country, have managed to stop this thing. But this fight goes on. I mean, it's as intense as ever right now. You've got, fortunately, folks like John Shimkus, Republican from Illinois, who's announced he won't run again for Congress. Same with Lamar Alexander, senator from Tennessee. These are top Republican dump proponents. But the big danger is they're going to want to establish their legacy and get their, holy grail of the Yucca dump before they retire.
Man, I've been inside Yucca Mountain. Have you been inside Yucca Mountain, Kevin?
Yeah, a couple times. Almost enough times to qualify for a silicosis class action lawsuit. I was one visit short.
Yeah, well, you can see the earthquake fault running through the tunnel at Yucca Mountain. I mean, it's really impressive. I've never seen
an earthquake fault. And you can see
fault.
the water stains on the walls as well. That would the waste burial containers.
It's really amazing that they would.
And the rock fall is proceeding apace. I mean, the rock fall in the tunnels was predicted to be severe over time, and they built the exploratory studies facility, the 5-mile entrance tunnel, some decades ago now, and the rock fall is already happening at Yucca Mountain.
Yeah,
long before they've built the burial tunnels off the side.
It's amazing. Talking with Kevin Kamps. Kevin, tell how people get a hold of you and support your work.
Well, our website is beyondnuclear.org, and you can also just email me at kevin@beyondnuclear.org. And,
we're talking about a nuclear waste bill going on. I'm going to have another show on Ohio. The bailout here, the assault on the referendum. I mean, it's astounding. I couldn't make this one up. The Ohio Secretary of State has asked the Ohio Supreme Court to not respond to a request from the federal judge on the referendum to bail out the nuclear power plants. It's a very complicated deal, but there was a delay in spreading signatures to get the repeal referendum on the ballot here, and the federal judge took it under advisement and said he'd withhold his decision on whether there can be more time to gather signatures to repeal the nuclear bailout. And the Secretary of State of Ohio has just asked the Ohio Supreme Court to ignore the request from the federal judge. I mean, these guys are so corrupt. Here we are on display in the impeachment hearings of a completely corrupt president in the White House. I got to say, Trump does surpass Nixon in terms of personal gain. No president has been more blatant in personal gain use of the White House than Trump. And Trump had a hand in promoting this bailout for First Energy, $1 billion bailout for 2 reactors, which I give the highest likelihood to explode, certainly Davis Vesey. And here the Ohio Secretary of State tells the Ohio Supreme Court to blow off the federal judge. I mean, God, it's mind-boggling. I'm sure that the lucre is flowing on the nuclear waste bill. I mean, the industry is desperate to get this, right, Kevin?
That's what's really driving the nuclear waste bill we're discussing, H.R. 2699, is the industry wants to offload its liability onto the public. They know just how dangerous high-level radioactive waste is, despite their assurances of safety to the contrary. So they want it off their sites, they want it off their ledgers, and incredibly, it's not a safety improvement that they're after. They're after just get this off our ledgers. And in fact, it's not a safety improvement. They're going to transport it through the whole country.
Well, thank you again, Kevin Kamps. Thanks for any Cushing. Thanks to the crew in New York. We'll see you next week
Either
in
way,
Solartopia.
we needed when the sun
Take care.
shone down on the Garden of Eden.